Welcome to this presentation entitled Teknonymy among the Cocos Malays, Personhood, Parenthood and Identity. It's based on research by myself, Nicholas Herriman, and my wife, Monica Winanita. So I get my name, Nicholas Herriman, from my father, whose name was Michael Herriman, and he got his name from his father, who was Raymond Herriman. And indeed, I passed my name down to my son, who is Joseph Herriman. But among the Cocos Malays, a different naming system operates. So you've got two kinds of names amongst the Cocos Malays. You've got the personal name, which is comprised of a given name plus your father's given name. So as my father's name is Michael Herriman, I would become Nicholas Michael, and my son would become Joseph Nicholas. The other one is the Teknonymy. Azrin went from being Azrin to Pat Naila, and Pat means father. To make it easier to remember, you can think Pat is like the English pa and Ma is like the English ma. So there's two kinds of names I'm going to be talking about today, personal name and Teknonymy. I'm going to say a lot of things about them, that they reflect the importance of being a parent and grandparent in the Cocos Malay world. Following Geertz, I'm going to give this idea that they provide a model or blueprint for how to behave in the world. I'll touch on the fact that you can adopt children and get one of these names for yourself. And as I'll say, this is what the highest purpose in life is. Also, even though it sounds like a traditional ye olde anthropology topic, it actually is really crucial in negotiating life with mainlanders such as myself. And as I promised, I'm going to discuss a little bit about the idea of kinship and the relational self. So the presentation structure goes like this. First, I'm going to give the old-fashioned literature review, which is on individual, and kinship. Then talk about economy, social structures and beliefs amongst the Cocos Malays. Then I'll get into the nitty-gritty of teknonyms and other naming practices. I'll talk about those in relation to cultural values of marriage, parenthood, individual and group identity, and then return to this idea of individual, and kinship in part 5, the discussion and conclusion. So part 1, individual. These ideas, the idea of individual, it comes from the idea that there are two kinds of self. One is an individual self, which Strathern calls a unitary self. This unitary self is autonomous, self-contained, independent, responsible for his or her or their own decisions and fate, and is self-reliant. So this has become prominent in the modern era. I guess this is kind of like a bourgeois individual self that develops from about 1500 in the West, but is present in other cultures. So the idea is just a self that is set off from other people. So just what we think of this atomized bourgeois individual. Then there's a relational self, which is called by other authors with slightly different inflections, a individual or partible self. And in that kind of form of self, which Westerners like myself experience through kinship, one is first and foremost an uncle or a granddaughter. In other words, relationships create the self. You are a bundle of relationships. Your identity as a relational self is a bundle of relationships. So amongst the Cocos Malays, you can see this on Hari Raya, which is like at the end of the fasting month. So just a couple of weeks ago on the Cocos Islands, people would families dress up in matching outfits. So you got this green family here and this blue and pink family here. And within that context, they interact with others. It's actually quite an incredibly emotional time. You pray and clean the graves of your ancestors and then go and bawling in tears, express remorse and beg for forgiveness of other families on the island. Now I should give some context and talk about the economy, social structures and beliefs in the islands. I'm just going to pick out some factors that seem to stick out for me. One that visiting journalists love to talk about is this West Island, which is mostly populated by mainlanders, and they sort of, visiting people portray this as a kind of party island where there are Westerners, impious Westerners who get drunk all the time, and Home Island is this pious, quiet place with pious Muslims. The story is actually a lot more complicated. You actually have some Home Islanders who come to West Island to escape that world. You have some mainlanders who live on Home Island and are extremely pious and committed Muslims. For there is a kind of rough division that Western mainlanders live on West Island, and on Home Island there are Cocos Malays. So on one side, West Island is here, the 100 people live right next to the airstrip there, which doesn't matter because the flight only comes in once or twice a week. And all the Malays, or most of the Malays, live on Home Island over here, which is on the eastern part of the lagoon. Another important point is to talk about the state-based economy. So basically the Cocos Islands ran off coconut export from 1830 to 1980. In 1984, the Cocos Malays voted to become part of Australia, and Australian wages and rates suddenly applied, making coconuts unprofitable. Once that happened, Centrelink stepped up. So this office here is a Centrelink office, probably the most important office on the island, because you've got unemployment somewhere like around 60, 70%. I think it's actually even higher when you factor in other kinds of pensions and disability allowances and so on. So there's very little in the way of work. My friend Ozzy, who's in this picture here, and I'll talk about later, Ozzy actually runs Home Island tours for foreign guests, but a lot of people just find it's not really possible to work and provide a livelihood, so they end up relying on Centrelink. And even the work that is there eventually boils down to the state anyways, because there's government there and spending money that you'll have teachers and for example, cleaners at the school and whatnot. So tourism is, as I mentioned, a potential economy, and this photo is taken from the bar on West Island. Big gender divide. Basically, the divide is men fish and women cook. That's probably the simplest way to think of it. Here I am with a guy, and he's got, I think it's called a Sweet Lips. I think it's a Sweet Lips. And women cook out the back. So here's our friend Net Sophia cutting up on what's called the balok, the block where all the fish is prepared. There's my daughter Kiki. She's my eldest, and as a result, I am called Pak Kiki on the island. That's my technonym there. Multiple generations in one home. The Australian government built these houses at the front like this. They're all on the same model in the 1980s, but as some houses became sort of empty, other houses became rather larger, and bigger family units moved out the back. And so this family built a huge double-story extension out the back. So you get multiple generations in one house. And I promised to talk about Islam. It's like really a crucial factor in life, and is getting more important. And this will come through in the naming practices as I get to later. But to foreshadow it, you get more Muhammad. So that's the kind of context I'm going to be talking about, technonyms and other naming practices. So everybody has an autonym. My autonym is Nicholas. Let's call it Nicholas. Azran and Norbia are two other autonyms. On Cocos, every single name, autonym, was unique. So in other words, you can't find two people with the same name. So you got Arifin, Enti, Pazan, Maseda, Iku, Iren, Rosiate, Radal, Yeyan. They gave their kids more Islamic sounding names, right? Rafiuddin, Ridauddin. At least 20 years ago, every single name would be different. But I think with Islamic names, we're getting more indications of consistency. For example, MHD here indicates Muhammad. So there are other Muhammads in the village. As part of that, there's a patronym. We'll start with Hisham. His name is Hisham McRae. He gets McRae from his dad's first name. Then he has a daughter, Imannia, and he passed down his first name to be Imannia's surname. So your surname is going to be your father's first name. So my dad's name is Michael Harriman. As a result, I would be called Nicholas Michael. This probably comes from an Islamic custom, which is you could bin or binti. So bin means son of, and binti means daughter of. So McRae bin Hadland, Hisham bin McRae, Imannia binti Hisham. So if I was Muslim Malay, my name would be Nicholas bin Mikhail, or Nicholas, son of Michael. So maybe you can do the same thing for your name. If you're a female, you become a binti. If you're a male, you become bin. Get your first name, put your bin or binti, and then put your father's first name, and that's your patronym. So let's look at this woman here. She shared with me her birth certificate, and her name is Zaiton Binti. BT means Binti Kasban. She was actually born in Singapore, and of Cocos Malay parents. Here's Zaiton, which actually means olive. And there's Kiki, my daughter, and Joey, my son. So she was Zaiton binti Kasban. I've never called her Zaiton because she became Ma'eke when I knew her, and she's now Net Ella, which is what we're talking about now, which is actually a Teknonymy. Let's go back to Imannia. So Imannia, when she was born, her mother became Ma. Remember Ma, think of Ma Imannia, and her father became Pak Imannia. So those of you who have children, just think of your eldest child, please. And if you're male, put Pak and your eldest child's name. My oldest is a daughter, so even if it's a female, you'll take her name. So I'm Pak Kiki and Mak Kiki. And if my mum and dad ever went on island, as they say, they would become Net Kiki and Net Kiki, okay? So let's look at the family tree and a good old-fashioned genealogy here. So there's Imannia down here. Her name goes upwards to her dad, Pak Imannia, and upwards to her mum, Ma Imannia. And for these two, it was their first grandchild through their daughter. So he becomes Net Imannia and she becomes Net Imannia. So the name ascends or goes up 2 generations. The Teknonymy, okay, that's the Teknonymy. Descending is the patronym. And we can see that working nicely here. So Anthony Abba was his name, and then his daughter takes his first name as her surname, so Zaini Anthony. And then she marries Yasri Asmara, and then she becomes Siti Rokeya Yasri. So the name goes down. You can see Anthony going down from being a first name to a surname. You can see Yasri going down from being a first name to a surname. And you can see Hisham going down from being a first name to a surname. You can also see Imannia going up 2 generations. And interestingly, you'll see Kaya. So, you know, in Australian English, we go Nicholas, Nick. In Malay indigenous language, you tend to abbreviate the opposite way, get the end of the name. So Kaya goes up to Kaya. Can you see Kaya going up from her to her grandfather's Net Kaya and Net Kaya? Okay, and you can see Imannia going up to her grandparents there. So a bit about the usage. If this Teknonymy is available and you know it, you have to use it. If you don't use it, it's going to be extremely offensive. That's a general rule, okay? It's also used in reference, like you can see here's some Tupperware. We have ritual meals almost every night. There'll be one or another with like 10 or 12 of the 400 people involved. This one says Net Amri, N meaning Net Amri. When you're done, you know this goes back to Net Amri. So it's used in daily speech. You can talk about, I would say, if I was talking to Nick Smith, Pak Francis was there today at my presentation. I would never say Ray was at my presentation. That would just be really offensive because it denies the most crucial part of life, which is being a parent. You see on messages going home. So this is my kids' class while I was there. There was Miss Holland, who was from the mainland, so she and unmarried, so she was just Miss Holland. And there's Iman, who we met before as Imannia's grandma. There are some exceptions I want to talk about. The first is you can sometimes call, I call, and I've heard other people on Ireland call older grandparents Net One and Net Ato. And Net One means Net Prumpuan, which means literally grandparent woman. Net Ato means grandparent smart old man. Net One, Net Ato. So we get some sort of gender reintroduced at these terms. Some people, after they go to pilgrimage, want to be known by their Haji, their pilgrim name, or as Haji or Hajja. The problem with that is that it sort of runs in contrast with other values, which are sort of associated with the Nenek Moyang, with the ancestors. There is an important exception that I really want to talk about, is that you don't use it for address in your own kin group. So if in my case, Kiki would never call me Pak Kiki, she'd just call me Pak. So that's a rough introduction to these names. So if I could just go through it. There are 2 two primary forms of name. One is this sort of patronymic, where you have a given name, let's say call it an autonym. That's what they call it in literature. I'm sorry, it sounds so pretentious, but an autonym, a given name like Nicholas, and then a patronym, which would be Michael for me. So my name would be Nicholas Michael. You have also a teknonym, which could be pa or ma if you're a father or mother, or a net if you're a grandparental generation. Let's consider this in relation to Hisham McRae. Hisham is his autonym. McRae is his patronym. Together they form what could be called his formal name. It's used in formal documents, but not in everyday language. Instead, we use a teknonym, Pa meaning father, and Imannia being his eldest child's name. So this is crucial, as talked about, in relation to cultural values of marriage, parenthood, individual and group identity. First thing I want to say about the naming principles is that you can sort of see them as roughly associating with the individual and individual identity I talked about before. The teknonyms and patronyms connect to kin and they express a individual identity, you could say on an obvious level. If I call myself Pakiki, my whole identity is tied up with my eldest child. And when I call myself Nicholas Michael, in the case where I get my dad's name as my surname, my dad's first name is my surname, the Michael bit connects me to my father. The autonyms, they are unique and they express an individual identity. My name, Nicholas, by itself, doesn't really connect me with anybody in my family. I think of some exceptions for that, but that's the general picture I think that emerges. So the first thing I want to point out in relation to that is that parenthood is crucial. When I was actually in the States for some reason a few years ago, and in Canada a few years ago, that a lot of the advertising was the same for parents for cars. Like, yeah, you're a parent, but you're also really, underneath it all, you're still that cool, wild, crazy individual that you used to be. Never got that sense amongst Cocos Malays of my generation or older. Got a sense that being a parent was a wonderful, wonderful blessing, such a huge blessing that gladly give up your identity as an individual to move into this higher level as I think they see it. And it's so important that adoption never legally recognized, as far as I can tell. It's very common to take if you don't have children, to take your sister's third child or your neighbor's third child or something like that. Adoption is very common too. And if you adopt a child, you would then take up that name. So and this is kind of reflected in the data. I'm not really a stats guy, but I pulled this up from the ABS. Basically, almost like Cocos Malay said, about twice as likely to be married as somebody on the mainland, about twice as likely. Higher status is from becoming a grandparent. Amongst my Cocos Malay informants, it's really a wonderful status to have. And it's trumps being a parent. It's one level higher, and you become, as I mentioned, this non-gendered net, meaning grandparent. So it all sounds lovely, but I guess it's a bit more complicated than that, because it divides and connects. I'll start with the connect bit first, actually. So it connects in the much that 4 generations may be present in a grandparent's name. So what I mean by that is we go back to that Imannia one. In her name, in Zaini Antony's name, you have 4 generations. You have both her father and her granddaughter. So there's 4 there. So it does connect that way, but it also divides. Married parents and grandparents are divided from childless parents. There's this kind of chasm that's irresolvable. Childless parents typically try to adopt, but the adoption might not work. If the kid just sleeps at their house for a few nights, then goes back to their original house, it will fail, and they'll always be known as wa, as in uncle or auntie, and they'll never have this status. Then again, if they are successful, they'll get a teknonym, and they're accepted as much parent as anybody else could be a parent. And in fact, in what I won't talk about in this lecture, people say that if you become, there's one more way to become a parent, which is through nursing. So if Monica was breastfeeding my son Noah, but also started breastfeeding another Cocos Malay girl, let's say, she would become part of our family in an extremely strong way. She could not marry any of my children, so there's an incest taboo straight up. And they would say that she's more one of our children than perhaps the other four. So there's a really special bond which comes from becoming from breastfeeding another child. But that's for another time. All I'm trying to point out here is that just through adoption is an extremely strong form of parenting. So people also miss out. So I've got 4 kids. I only get my name from Kiki. The other 3 kids, Joey, Mimi, and Noah, all miss out. And their names don't go up to me, nor they go up to my grandparents and so on. And of course, as we've seen, women's names don't descend at all, which is something we're familiar in the West. Though not in Spanish-speaking Western countries, but other cultures. So I guess you could say that, you know, younger siblings miss out, but I wonder if it's really missing out. Because given names, I'm going to suggest, are really unimportant. Particularly in an earlier generation, the usage of given names was quite whimsical. You'd have people called alias, desk, hotel, darling, wedding, that's wezen, manjar or manager, boss, yet, and not, just for fun. Or you get Cocos Malay words. You have dari, pada, mana, which means from, to, or where. So what I'm trying to get at is there's something to have a bit of fun with, and they are something that you hopefully grow out of. And once you have children, you no longer are referred to them. There's something you, in a sense, can leave behind, except for informal contexts like writing wills and whatnot. Generally, the given names should not be used. So for me to call Ray Madden Ray would be quite offensive, actually, amongst the Cocos Malays. There's a kind of taboo against it. It would be undermining the most important thing in the world, which is to be a father or a mother or a grandparent. It'd be undermining that. And even, you know, if Ray becomes vice chancellor or even becomes, I don't know, premier or gets a knighthood, as far as I can tell, nothing trumps that. In other societies with technonyms, I've heard from other people working in Southeast Asia, if you become like a, I don't know, some sort of leader, you would take that title. But I haven't come across a single case amongst the Cocos Malays where another title would take precedence over your technonymy. And I think that gets back to the importance that I was talking about before. Okay, so then there's the problem of why do you, when you get to the grandparents, why can you also call the male grandparent net ato and the female grandparent net one? And the reason for that is, I think that, again, this gets back to personal names being whimsical and unimportant. And the further you can elevate yourself from the world of given names, the higher you've got in the purpose of life. So again, just to contrast this is a number plate spotted in Bandura where I live. It's called Unique. Another one that I didn't get a photo of in time because it was like doing a burnout and sped by is You Wish. Personalized number plates here actually indicate the individuality, whereas on Home Island, you've got a grandfather clause, so old cars are still there, but now you have to buy golf buggies or four-wheelers. So these people have Mia, the name of their daughter. That's actually Pat Mia and Mat Mia, and Mia's the name of their personalized plates. So Izahan's parents, who we saw before, they've got Izzy on their plates. Muaz and Medina have M&M. So I think you can see this even in attempts to be personalized become individualized. Another point I wanted to bring up is that technonyms are also used by and for people from the mainland. So we get called Pa and Mak Kiki, and it's, for Cocos Malays, it's a way of accommodating mainlanders into their world on their own terms. So where does this leave us? In general, I think my conclusion is that technonyms reflect how crucial parenting is in Cocos Malay society, and that they express a kind of relational self that exists in tandem with an individual self. So thank you for listening so patiently.